What is the most disturbing fact about serial killers that you know? Story 1. The Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway. When I was a new teacher at a Native American school, we had Dave Reichart come speak to us about how Native American women made up a much higher number of victims of serial killers. He told us that when they were interviewing Ridgway after they finally got him to admit his crimes, he had violation and eliminate an adult worker one night. And then the next evening after dinner, he went to run an errand with his 6-year-old son. His son fell asleep in his truck, so he decided to drive back to the corpse and had intimacy with it while his kid was still sleeping in the truck. They asked him, what would he have done if his son had caught him? And he answered, well, I would have eliminated him, of course. The detective said he said this casually and without any emotion. Answer. One of my junior high friend's dads worked with him at Kenworth. Apparently, he used to leave random jewelry in the ladies' bathroom. We now know it was probably from victims. Everyone there was creeped out by him. My mom's best friend was a taxi driver during the height of his killings and thought she knew who it was. She died before he was indicted. I still wonder if she was right. Story 2. Carla Homalaka pled down to manslaughter after participating in the takedown of at least 3 teen girls, including her own sister. She served a short sentence, after which she married her defense lawyer's brother. They had 3 kids together, and she lives free in Quebec. Answer. She served a short sentence because she got a plea deal to testify against the even more monstrous Paul Bernardo, her husband and Canada's most infamous serial killer rapist. She served 12 years, and he will never get out. The outrageous part was that in her plea deal, she cast herself as an unwilling participant and a victim herself. After the deal was done, police discovered tapes of her very eagerly participating in the crimes, but it was too late. The reason they didn't find them earlier was that Bernardo's lawyer had found them in the house and only turned them over to police partway through the trial, after the plea deal had been made. Story 3. Richard Chase, the vampire of Sacramento, believed if a house was unlocked or the door was open, that the victims were inviting him in. He believed it gave him permission to ambush them, eliminate the entire family, mutilate their bodies, and drink their blood. Story 4. One of the worst, Pedro Lopez, served 14 years in jail. Then he was released 2 years early, put in an asylum, then was declared sane and released on a 7-day bail. He promptly disappeared. Answer. While these claims are unverifiable, it is known that Lopez was briefly captured by indigenous people from the Ayacucho region in south-central Peru after attempting to abduct a 9-year-old girl. The Ayacuchoans stripped Lopez of his clothes and belongings and buried him in the sand. However, an American missionary convinced them to release Lopez and turn him over to the police. The police did not detain Lopez, and he was instead expelled from the country. No, not the missionary. This is like the British dude who didn't shoot Hitler when he had the chance. By being a good and idealistic person, they inadvertently caused a crazy number of innocent, torturous deaths. He should have stayed in the sand. Story 5. David Parker Ray, a.k.a. the Toy Box Killer, would abduct women and then subject them to weeks of physical and intimacy torture before letting them go after giving them a cocktail of substances to make them forget their time together. The worst part, though, is he had a recording he would play for newly abducted women about what to expect. Transcripts of this recording exist, and I say this as a true crime fan who has read some fudge things. It's one of the most disturbing things I've ever read. Answer. The weirdest thing to me is that the recording ends with, "Have a nice day," like what was said beforehand wasn't incredibly fudge up, especially the part involving his German Shepherd. It also messes with me the idea that this was so routine, he recorded it. He thought, I'm tired of repeating myself during this post-kidnapping orientation, so I'm just going to record it. Also, we don't know and will never know his true victim count. Story 6. Did a research paper back in college, and if you look at the Hunting Humans, the encyclopedia of serial killers, it is disturbing how many were in jail previously for assault, violation, manslaughter, etc., and let out to extend their activity. Answer. I met the last victim of a serial killer. He survived by sheer luck after his roommate, who was a flight attendant, came home unexpectedly after his flight was canceled and interrupted the killer from finishing him off. He had been drugged and bound and gagged. The cops recovered photos of the killer, who is now in prison for life, putting blunt objects and weapons against his head and neck in preparation for dismembering him as he did to other victims. It was during this pre-eliminate photo shoot that the roommate came home and saved his life without knowing it. Turns out the serial killer and this intended victim had hung out before, and it was this time that he decided to go in for the eliminate. Tragically, the police had investigated him before for intimacy assault after others had come forward, but declined to press charges and dismissed the complaints because it was deemed a gay community problem. I almost threw up hearing the details. Story 7. I forget the exact number, but the FBI estimated that at any given time there are 50 active murderers in the U.S. that no one has yet identified as a serial killer. Story 8. Ed Gein used to give his neighbors venison. At his takedown trial, he said he never eliminate a deer. Answer. I'm a complete nerd, and I will sound like one for a second, but Ed Gein was by definition not a serial killer. He only eliminated 2 women, and suspected of having to do with his brother's passing on the farm. And you need 3 confirmed victims to be classified as a serial killer. He was mostly a grave robber who was really into older women. Eliminate 2 of them, and getting caught quite quickly because he was really bad at it. He also heavily denied being a cannibal for whatever reason. But about 25 years later, Jeffrey Dahmer started eating people in nearby Milwaukee, roughly 2 hours from Plainsfield where Gein lived, operated. Story 9. It's weird to me how normal they are in that they could do heinous things and just go about their day, like it doesn't affect them at all. I watched the Night Stalker documentary about Richard Ramirez, and he just didn't seem to feel any type of way about anything. And his victims were all different ages, races, and genders. He didn't really have a preference. No certain thing that triggered him. Sometimes he'd take down. Sometimes he didn't. Sometimes it was SA, sometimes it was torture. He just chose randomly and made it up as he went. Story 10. Dean Corll inserted glass tubes into the urethras of teenage boys he abducted, which he then shattered with a ball-peen hammer while he had them bound. He would do this and other terrible things to them for up to days at a time before takedown them. Also, Corll invented the handcuff trick that Gacy later used. The handcuff trick was, you would tell a naive young person that you could show them a cool trick on how to escape handcuffs. Have them bind themselves, then tell them, the trick is, you need a key, and proceed to take down them. Answer. Whoa, the handcuffs thing just triggered a childhood memory. I had a Cub Scout leader who was later convicted of molesting boys at a YMCA summer camp. Anyway, one day after a cookout in a park or something, he's giving me a ride home. He also was my neighbor, and he had a pair of handcuffs in the front seat of his car. I remember jokingly cuffing myself to the seat, and he got real weird. I was never touched by this guy, but I wonder what was going on in his head. Story 11. I'm telling you there are at least 2 serial killers in Trinity County, CA, probably living in either Weaverville, Lewiston, or possibly Hayfork, but it's for sure one of those towns. They're super small towns with just a little over or under 3,000 people each, but way too many people go missing. Google it. I'm not kidding, so many people just vanish, are found. It's not just hikers getting lost, though that happens pretty often out there too, but I can't even begin to count the amount of bodies that suddenly be found out in the woods, are found in the rivers, or floating in the lake. Even kids vanish sometimes. There's literally a 2-decades-old little memorial set up in Something Moon Park that's next to the Joss house for one of them. I talk about a certain case of someone I knew IRL who literally rented from us who vanished, but I'm not sure the subreddit rules about that, as it's in that weird middle ground of being a cold case active, so I'm just going to avoid dropping her name here. The cops out there always brush off the bodies and missing people as substances problems, but that's a load of bullshit. They care so little that they've even taken to calling them trimmigrants, aka trimming immigrants, because they come out to work the pot harvest. I know I can't speak for all of them, but from what I grew up with, most of them are just chill hippie types who will literally stop to help you change a flat tire or chase down your horse for you if it gets away. Hell, they'd even show up for the search parties. And if that wasn't enough reason to doubt the substances claim, half the time, they're the ones printing off missing person flyers and handing them around themselves. Sure, a few of the head guys are straight-up criminals you don't want to mess with, but they're also the ones basically keeping the towns afloat, and we all knew it. The bosses would buy fertilizer in bulk from stores or by paying farmers for manure, and that would keep the hardware and grocery stores alive because, let me tell you, they needed a ton of stuff for their compounds. I literally remember one of the big bosses coming down with a translator and telling people he'd give them 20 grand cash for any information that led to whoever was doing it. Then the sheriff told us that anyone caught accepting money and giving him information would be arrested for criminal activity. And if that wasn't enough, I used to know a couple of the search and rescue guys who'd go out on searches, and they'd always say there were sections of the woods they were told not to go into. I'm not joking when I say some of them eventually quit because they swore there was something off about the people running the searches. We're not talking about risky areas either, just literal fields and some of the less rugged hills. But the main reason no one's been caught yet, other than the fact nothing's done about it, is the fact that Trinity County has no shortage of places to hide things. There are tons of abandoned mine shafts, forests, lakes, and I shoot you not, there are even tunnels under Weaverville's Main Street that connect to all the businesses that connect back to the old Chinese temple. I'm not going to make this any longer by shoving a history lesson in here, but back in the gold rush when they were building the Down, Chinese workers weren't allowed on the roads, so they wound up carving their own roads underground. If you think I'm shoot you, you can literally still tour them today. There used to be more, but supposedly those collapsed, but I'm not so sure. If that wasn't enough, being out in the woods means there's mountain lions, and whenever they scream, the locals write about them all the time on the local Facebook groups, just in case it's not actually a cougar. I loved living out there, but we just couldn't do it anymore after our renter vanished out of nowhere. Nothing was done about it. She was a local since birth, and the cops still called her just another trim-migrant. Story 12. Albert Fish wrote a letter to the parents of a little girl he eliminated, telling them how tasty she was when he ate her. Story 13. John Wayne Gacy eliminated his first victim due to a misunderstanding. He picked up a 16-year-old who had just arrived in his city from out of town and brought him home with him. Nothing intimacy happened. Then in the morning, the kid went to make breakfast and happened to be holding a kitchen knife in his hand when he went to Gacy's room to wake him. Gacy mistakenly thought the kid was trying to do him in and eliminate him as a result, even when the boy showed no signs of resistance and even signaled he was surrendering. That takedown was the one that set him off on his eliminate spree because he realized he got off on eliminate people. What's even worse is that the boy came from a loving family, and right before he met Gacy, he was traveling to Iowa to see his aunt. They didn't bother looking for him when he failed to contact them because they were used to him traveling extensively and simply hoped he would call them eventually. Their clue that he was never coming back was when his grandfather died 2 years after he was taken down, and he didn't show up at the funeral. Story 14. How often many of them could be caught or practically did something in plain sight, and the investigators or police fumbled the ball. Story 15. John Wayne Gacy had so many victims cramped in his basement, crawl space, to the point where when the bodies decomposed, they fused, melded together, and there are still some who have yet to be identified. Answer. There's another, sad, layer to this. I took a forensics class in university. Teacher was a local cop who worked in conjunction with the FBI, so he had some great connections. One of them who came as a guest speaker was one of the original investigators who worked the Gacy case. He told us some of the victims are unnamed because family who lost their sons didn't want to claim them, even though their sons were missing, likely victimized. They didn't want the stigma of their child being potentially seen as gay. It's terrible to think these poor kids can't even be put to rest after their traumatic ends, because the people that should have loved and protected them feel misplaced shame. Story 16. Dorothea Puente escaped police custody in 1988 by asking the cops if she could go next door and grab a cup of coffee. She was an old lady, so they let her, and they ended up finding her in LA a bit later. Story 17. There was a serial killer in Toronto. At one point in the investigation, a tip led them to a very secluded cabin in the woods where humans were being eliminated, cooked, and eaten. It turned out to be unrelated to their serial killer. When they finally caught their killer, he was seconds away from take down his next victim. Story 18. Rose Westwood had gotten away with her part of the crimes her and her husband committed, but didn't because she made a mistake about the disappearance of Fred's stepdaughter. The police did the math and realized that Fred was in jail when the stepdaughter was eliminated, so it had to be Rose. She also became besties with Myra Hindley from the Moors takedown in prison. Story 19. We only catch the bad ones. Guys like the Golden State take decades to find, and Hewlett's usually dumb luck. Answer. Then there is Ed Kemper, who turned himself in because he was satisfied after his final eliminate, his mom and her best friend, but was worried he might eliminate again. The police actually didn't take his confession seriously at first because he was so calm and nice, as well as well associated with law enforcement officers. He was so charismatic and intelligent that he fooled a lot of people until he had to turn himself in. Even in prison, he was the same way with the guards. Story 20. The lead theory. The reason there were so many serial killers in the 70s is because lead use was at its peak. Lead pipes, leaded gasoline, etc. The decline in lead exposure aligns pretty directly with decline in serial killers in nations that banned it in gas and such. Obligatory note that correlation does not mean causation. Answer. Does the decline in lead exposure also correlate with developments in surveillance and forensic technology? Because my thought has always been that it would be way harder to serial eliminate these days, given nearly everyone has a phone with a camera in it, and security cameras are all over the place. One little takedown maybe? Even a spree. But to gather multiple victims over time without getting caught these days just doesn't seem as easy to me. Story 21. They pretend to be so normal in everyday life, it is frightening. His wife Nancy made Ghislaine Maxwell look like saint. Story 22. Just knowing the BTK called his climaxes during his killings Sparky Big Time absolutely disgusts me. The toy box killer effectively wiped the memories of his victims using a combination of sodium pentothal, phenobarbital, and other barbiturates. There's a lot of really fudge-up shoot, and I could go on. Story 23. So many at one time or another spent time in Bellingham, Washington. It's strange. After spending time there, it makes sense. Serial killers who spent time there include Kenneth Bianchi, the Hillside Strangler, John Allen Muhammad, and Lee Boyd Malvo, the DC Snipers, Ted Bundy, Darren O'Neill, and Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Story 24. I think the most disturbing fact is that the ones we know about are just the ones we know about. And I don't mean like we just don't catch all of them. I mean that some things just don't make the headlines in the same way. I say this because I've worked in healthcare for a long time, and as an EMT and an ER for most of my career thus far. You'd really surprised by the things I've been privy to. And I say this as an American in 2025, where literally nothing is surprising anymore. I also want to stress that this isn't because we just happen to see patients who had somehow been impacted by a serial killer, but that we got a lot of involuntary psych admissions and would ultimately hear the stories they were willing to share. I would often have to do high-security psych observations for like 12 hours at a time. You'd hear some wild shoot. Also, not serial killers necessarily, but when I worked in a pediatric hospital, they would run any visitors to the hospital and any adults getting admitted with their child to a unit from the ER through Megan's Law before being allowed on patient units. It was a daily occurrence that some kid's dad or their mom's boyfriend would flag on Megan's Law, and staff would have to explain to the family why the dude was being escorted out of the building instead of staying with the family. Usually the family had no idea until that moment. Yikes. Story 25. The most prolific serial killer we know of, Harold Shipman, wasn't your typical lone wolf or outsider. He was a well-respected, well-paid doctor with little to no reason to eliminate. We still don't really know why he did what he did. Psychologists have suggested everything from split personality to perhaps he eliminated by accident and found he got a buzz from it, and even that, because of his station, he might have been deludedly creating a problem for himself to fix. Shipman's targets were the elderly who he would prescribe bad doses of medication that would eventually eliminate them. Because of their advanced age, it was believed to be just old age that eliminate them, so that's how he flew under the radar for so long. A taxi driver, John Shaw, realized his regulars he would drop off to the local general practitioner were dying off at an alarming rate. He raised his concerns and even went to the police, but was rebuffed as a crazy person. Shaw later gave testimony at Shipman's trial regarding 21 of his known 215 victims. It is believed Shipman eliminated more, but that was the least they could confirm. Fun little extra fact. My dad used to work at our local hospital, and for certain criminals, they used to pick hospitals at random for treatment, so no one knew they were there. He was on his way into work when he saw a little old man getting escorted into a police van at the main door. Story 26. Just how close Rose West, British serial killer who take down dozens with her husband Fred, got to getting away scot-free with all of her crimes. She was able to lie her way through everything, claiming Fred was abusive and forced her to help dispose of the bodies. She spun such an intricate web of lies that it pinned everything on him. And when he eliminated himself in prison, either to protect her or out of despair, that meant they had to give her a plea bargain since they couldn't prove anything else otherwise. If not for the fact that Fred had an alibi for when Rose eliminated her stepdaughter Charmaine, the cops wouldn't have nailed her. Story 27. On average, the job profession most likely to harbor a serial killer is commercial truck drivers. The job as a semi-truck driver gives legitimate reasons to travel vast distances, and while weights are closely monitored, there are ways to fudge the numbers. The vast majority of the victims will be intimacy workers. There may be hundreds of said killers on the road as of now. We depend on commercial truck drivers, and many are good people, but this is probably the most disturbing fact I want to bring to show and tell. Sorry, CDL holders. Story 28. My mom worked with John Wayne Gacy's first wife after he went to prison in Iowa, and she moved back to Springfield, Illinois. Story 29. John Wayne Gacy had a side gig as a clown and worked at children's parties. Some of his victims were boys at those parties. Imagine being entertained, bouncing on the lap of a clown one day, and that same dude unmasked is kidnapping, torturing, and take down you the next. Freaking A. Story 30. Albert Fish enjoyed pain. He'd pick fights for the pleasure of being beaten. He'd stick spiky rose stems down his urethra, stick cotton balls soaked in adult beverage up his bum and set it alight. He'd insert needles into his groin so he'd feel pain while sitting. He had his kids beat him with a nail-studded paddle. He was immensely sick in the head. He also eliminate, and cannibalized children. Story 31. My background. I have a degree in forensic psych. Took Dr. Rosmo's serial killer class. He created geographic profiling. They based numbers on him. Then I went to grad school for neuroscience. Not disturbing but interesting. Most cases have a geographic profile to them. Killers work in a certain radius from their home or work. Far enough they won't get recognized due to a regular routine, but close enough they are familiar with their surroundings. Story 32. I had a locker mate in high school in Eureka, CA. He ended up being one of the ones who take down someone. Abe Gerving. I said hi every day, had no idea. Story 33. IDK if he was a serial killer, but a Nazi in Texas requested a super extravagant meal as his last meal and refused to eat it, and now the state doesn't allow prisoners a last meal beyond prison food. Story 34. Everything we think we know about serial killers has been built upon information gleaned exclusively from the serial killers who were caught. Story 35. Some of them kept trophies from their victims. Not valuables, but things like teeth, hair, or body parts. Story 36. The Manson family planned to eliminate a bunch of celebrities. One of their plans was to take down Frank Sinatra, skin him, make purses out of his skin, and sell them at the farmer's market. Answer. I met one of Charlie Manson's kids. I mentioned something about serial killers at a party, and he got curious in a weird way, and I jokingly said, "What, like if you're Charlie Manson's son?" And he freaked out, full fury. His face completely changed, and his eyes went flat black, like soulless, rage-filled, and he started yelling, "Who told you?" at me, over and over. Other partygoers separated him from me, and I don't know where he was the rest of the party, but the likeness to his father was rather startling. Story 37. That some women love them. I found out about Sandra London a while back. Marries one incarcerated SK, only to exploit him for his stories. She's a true crime author, and then get off on dumping him for another SK. You can find an Errol Morris episode on her, as well as plenty of media on YouTube. Story 38. Scary thing to me is how many lived very normal lives and didn't raise any suspicion amongst those they interacted with daily. Story 39. There's a good chance John Wayne Gacy didn't work alone. If that's the case, his accomplices are still out and were never caught. Story 40. Apparently, quite a few of them are described as smelling specifically like rotten milk. Not regular body odor, not decomposition, specifically milk that's gone bad. That's a really specific smell, and not something people typically smell like even with terrible hygiene. No one's quite sure why. Story 41. Not a fact, but a story. My great-grandma used to shop at the store Ted Bundy used to work at, and she really, really loved him. She introduced him to my aunt and pretty much forced my aunt into a date with him by nagging her. My aunt said she made up an excuse and left after a couple minutes because of how creepy he was. She said he was very fake and his emotions kept flip-flopping, like he'd be talking about something and pretend like it didn't bug him. But then his mask would slip for a second and he'd show his real self, then slip back into his fake self and keep talking. Then his mask would slip again. My aunt said he was very handsome, but his personality was so fake it scared her, so she wouldn't talk to him anymore after that. Story 42. The Night Stalker would call his victims and creepily whisper, I'll eliminate you. Albert Fish would embed nails into his genitals, some of which never got taken back out. John Wayne Gacy kept the rotting corpses of his victims under his house. Jeffrey Dahmer was baptized in the same moment John Wayne Gacy was executed. Joe Menthe would serve the remains of his victims as burgers to his customers. The otaku killer strangled his fist victim with his deformed hands, did things to the body and left it to rot. All his victims were children. Story 43. I used to go to a dive bar in Chicago, LL Lounge, where both John Gacy and Jeffrey Dahmer apparently frequented. I might have been there at the same time as Dahmer. I think Dahmer liked it because of the Punkin' Donuts across the street. Story 44. Israel Keyes had no MO. His attacks were random-ish and would never have been connected if he hadn't admitted to them. The idea of a serial killer with no defined MO freaks me out. Story 45. That most of the ones we know about are the dumb ones, or ones who got caught almost by accident. The smart and successful ones don't get caught very often. And on top of that, the FBI profiling experts agree that there are probably several serial killers active in the U.S. that do not continually take down with the same methods, dispose of bodies with the same methods, or even remain in the same area. They believe that movies, films, and books about serial killers and their methods have instructed a whole new generation of serial killers on how to remain at large. Story 46. Jeffrey Dahmer eliminated his first victim just weeks after graduating high school. He was later pulled over by police with the dismembered body in garbage bags in his car at 3 in the morning. Dahmer claimed it was regular garbage that he forgot to take out and was taking them to the dump because he couldn't sleep, and the police believed him and let him go. Had those cops even bothered taking a closer look, Dahmer's eliminate spree would have ended before it began. Story 47. Charles Manson never actually take down anyone. Now he thought he did, but old Charlie wasn't a banger on details. Story 48. Personal opinion. The substances wars of the 70s and 80s financially incentivized police departments to shift their attention away from major crimes like serial killers and rapists that are more difficult to investigate to chasing down substances, which just required shaking down hippies and minorities. I'm not fully convinced that the number of prolific serial killers dropped, but instead police just stopped investigating them until they absolutely had to, either by sheer number of victims or public pressure. Plus, they learned people were happy that police were getting substances off the streets, opposed to people being terrified and thinking they're incompetent about police chasing an elusive murderer around the city. Story 49. Survival bias combined with large-scale publishing of data related to serial killers has reduced the number we've been able to stop, and it's getting worse. Essentially, serial killers are adjusting their habits to avoid the mistakes of the ones who have been brought to justice. And we've spent so long pushing these studies that we are struggling to catch up. Story 50. The fact that we all know so much about them, and their names achieve legendary status, but the names and faces of their victims just disappear into history. The fact that we cast people like Zac Efron and Charlie Hunnam to star as these psychotic losers shows how much we revere what should be the cretins of society. Story 51. That the Canadian government fought tooth and nail to not only have Karla Homolka released, but supplied her with a completely new identity. Paul Bernardo will likely be released within my lifetime with the same deal. Ken and Barbie killers, if you feel like going down that gory trail. Answer. The most disturbing part of this case, to me, is how after Homolka had her plea deal to put Bernardo away, the videotape of them both being very into committing the takedown together was found, but there was no going back. They're both monsters. She lives free and has a reasonably comfortable life. Feel bad for her kids. Imagine Googling your mom and finding all the horror of it out. Story 52. I did a project on serial killers when I was in junior high or so, and the only thing I really remember is that a lot of them had a history of torturing or eliminate animals first. Story 53. Peter Curtin, the vampire of Dusseldorf. Shortly before his head was placed on the guillotine, Curtin turned to the prison psychiatrist and asked the question, "Tell me, after my head is chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." When asked whether he had any last words to say, Curtin simply smiled and replied, "No." Story 54. that it's highly likely there are serial killers who target poor black girls in the ghetto, as police never put much effort into finding them if they are missing. This sounds like a conspiracy theory, but there is a fair amount of statistical evidence that backs it up. Answer: definitely not just a conspiracy theory. Look up the Highway of Tears. It's a massive highway known for the number of indigenous people, mostly women and girls, who have gone missing or been taken down on that highway. Almost all those cases go unsolved or are never looked into at all. It's absolutely horrifying how little the world government cares about POC. Story 55.
Sword and Scale Podcast from 13 Beverly Hills, Colin Flooring. Guy driving around back roads would see a person alone, blast them with 12 GA, go on with their life. Some 7 or so eliminate and decides to stop. Case went cold. After a decade, gets tipsy in a bar and spouts his exploits to a stranger.
Stranger contacts law, Guy admits. They have several convicted murderers and their stories. That one was in my backyard, so it stuck out, but they have several interesting ones. Story 56. The serial killers we all know about that are famous are the worst ones, the failures. The good ones are the ones who never get caught. We'll never even notice their crimes. A quote comes to mind that relates: the difference between a famous pirate and a famous smuggler is if you're a famous smuggler, you're not doing it right. Story 57. The first time I read Ed Kemper's Wikipedia page, I thought, okay, that's enough internet for today. It appears to have been edited since then. But at one point it described that after taking down his mother, he used her severed head to perform fellatio on himself. Story 58. Jeffrey Dahmer poured acid on the brain of a 14 Laotian boy after drugging and raping him, all while another victim, Tony Hughes, lay dead in his home. His name was Konarak Synthasamphone. He managed to get out of Dahmer's home and caught the attention of the police after a concerned neighbor found him naked, injured, and acting erratic after a literal acid lobotomy. Dahmer convinced the cops it was just a lover's quarrel or something along those lines and was just tipsy. The cops let him go back home with him. He would pour more acid on his brain, this time eliminate him. H then dismembered him and out his head in the freezer. Dahmer would be apprehended about a month later, but not before take down 4 more people. Story 59. An Israel Keys fact that keeps me up at night. Serial killer notorious for the Alaska coffee stand, kidnapping and takedown of Samantha Koenig. Before he eliminated himself in custody, he confessed that he had committed several other takedowns that went unsolved, but never revealed all of the details. He said that in some cases, he staged the takedown of his victims to look like an accident, and the cases were officially closed as accidental deaths. To this day, those families still think their loved one died accidentally, but the truth of his victims' demises died with him, and the world will literally never know. Story 60. The podcast, The Clown and the Candyman, really disturbed me. They built a strong case for the killings of John Wayne Gacy and Dean Corll being directly related to a child-adult content trafficking ring. The fact that those who assisted Mark Dutroux, along with his wife, is very disturbing. Though not authoritative and should be taken with a huge grain of salt, Programmed to Eliminate is a fantastic book. Story 61. That most health insurance CEOs still walk free among us and will never take responsibility for countless unnecessary deaths. Story 62. What's disturbed me the most is listening to the tapes of the Toolbox murderers and their takedown, violation, and torture of 16-year-old Shirley Lynette Ledford. The tape is online. It's awful, horrifying, and sad to listen to. Don't do it. You'll regret it. Tonight. Story 63. Andre Chikatilo, a.k.a. the Red Ripper, Rostov Ripper, responsible for the violation and takedown of over 50 children and women from the 70s to his capture in the early 90s during the SU Fall, was due to severe corruption and incompetence by the local police, despite numerous reporting, suspicions, and leads from the locals that he was acting off-kilter and in area of these crimes. Yet due to the Soviet Union being a communist country, any and all legitimate reports of serious crime and criminals was either downplayed or completely dismissed to the political propaganda, communist agenda of low to no serious nationwide crime and illusion of a utopian society. Story 64. Just that there are probably hundreds of active serial killers in the U.S. right now, and many of them are interstate truck drivers. Story 65. It is currently unknown how many, if any, active serial killers there are in the military. Since they require us to move every few years, it's impossible to tell because their MO wouldn't be recognized as a pattern when spread across the entire U.S. Additionally, since roughly 7 of known serial killers have had a military background, it means they aren't getting caught, which makes sense because the military doesn't want you to know about people like that. They make them disappear, one way or another. We wouldn't want the military looking bad when the civilians find out that we allowed serial killers to run rampant in deployment war zones and then brought them back home. The monsters are hiding amongst the heroes. Source: my 23 years of active duty. Story 66. By most accounts, Andre Chikatilo was an unassuming family man. Quiet and awkward, but didn't really stick out. He violation, takedown, and cannibalized dozens of victims, possibly 100. Many of his victims were never found, and he couldn't even remember where he buried some of them. Due to issues with the investigation, he was able to eliminate a young girl just days before he was caught. He mutilated his victims with a knife in his teeth. His first confirmed victim was only 9 years old, and it kickstarted a 12-year eliminate spree. Before he started eliminate, he even spent time as a school teacher. After he was tried, the Russians did what I believe to be the right thing and shot the bastard in the back of the head before burying him in an unmarked grave. The bastard will burn for all eternity. Story 67. Dennis Rader, BTK, was so confident he wouldn't get caught that he wrote letters taunting the police for years. That's actually how they ended up tracking him down. Story 68. A lot of the Golden State Killer messed me up. He was a cop. He had a family who assumed he was normal because he had such a good human mask that he had crafted. That man got up at like 7 a.m., did a whole cop shift, got home at like 5 p.m., had dinner and went to bed at like probably exactly 8 p.m., proceeded to drive 90 minutes to stalk, harass, etc., maybe driving back at like 2 a.m., and only getting a few hours of sleep before doing it all again. Everyone associated with the case assumed he had to be a local, because how else did he know so much? He would attack on the days of the week the husband worked or when the women were alone. He knew schedules and home layouts, even having some logistical idea of how he did it. It still makes so little sense. How did he do it? He was caught stealing dog repellent. He knew both that he couldn't just buy it, but also that the homes he was attacking had dogs. I think another part of it was that if he was a cop and a total piece of shoot to anyone he apprehended, especially in those days, we might never hear about it. Rough someone up enough and they wouldn't want to risk reporting it. Everything I learned about D'Angelo has horrified me. Story 69. It's wild how many should have been arrested way earlier if the police had taken complaints and tips seriously. Story 70. More than a few of them had been fairly normal kids until they got banged on the head by something. The thought of being myself until I accidentally stand up too fast and hit the wrong part of my head on something stupid, and then abruptly changing into someone who can not only justify but crave violence, scares the crap out of me. Story 71. The most intelligent and cunning would-be serial killers never become actual serial killers. They would instead use those skills to become CEOs or leaders in important places where they can be sociopathic in their line of work. Story 72. On March 10, 2004, British Columbia health officials revealed that Robert Pickton may have ground up human flesh and mixed it with pork that he sold to the public. Story 73. Sociopaths in general have no remorse, but are manipulative. Some folks go on to become takedown rapists, and others who mask it better become CEOs or other field leaders due to the ability to be cold and calculating, moving them up their career ladder. Adding one note, a diagnosed sociopath wrote a memoir, if you want additional context and life experience. Currently reading it, but have not finished, Sociopath, a memoir, hardcover, April 2, 2024. By PhD Patrick Gagne, author. Story 74. There's a theory that the origin story of werewolves, vampires, and the like were inspired by old instances of serial killers. People assumed only a monster could inflict such senseless brutality on a human. Story 75. That Ted Bundy visited the grave sites of his victims days later to pleasure himself with the rotting corpses. Sorry. Story 76. A young nurse in Saskatoon, SK, Canada, who went for a walk one night in 1962 and 2 weeks later was found in a shallow grave just blocks from home, had a next-door neighbor who was the unwilling accomplice of a serial killer in the 1920s. Story 77. Notice how serial killers are a thing of the past? I can't name a single serial killer from 5, 10 years ago. I guess they all morphed into mass shooters. Story 78. The fact that most caught have admitted to knowing who to target so they wouldn't get caught for a while. In other words, they knew it was wrong. So they held in their urges until they could find someone society didn't care about, then let it all out, because they also knew that very few would care enough about the victim. Story 79. The butcher baker, Robert Hansen, targeted strippers and prostitutes because earlier on, he had attacked a woman from like an office, but had also been arrested for an attack on an adult worker. They ended up only charging him with the office lady's attack, so that's where he learned that law enforcement won't care enough about dancers and prostitutes to really try to solve their disappearance stake down. Story 80. Many serial killers, like John Wayne Gacy and Ted Bundy, were famously charming and charismatic, enabling them to gain their victims' trust. This deeply unsettling ability to appear completely normal makes the concept of stranger danger far more complex and terrifying. Story 81. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, had his brother turn him in to the FBI 3 times before they then finally listened to him. They want to take credit for catching him. You can't eat your cake and have it too, guys. Story 82. Read Programmed to Eliminate by Dave McGowan and follow it up with Aberration in the Heartland of the Real. Serial killers are a very different phenomenon than we've been led to understand by true crime media. Story 83. IDK about fact, but it's highly likely that John Wayne Gacy had several accomplices that went on to be serial killers in their own right, and they were all part of a larger network of depraved weirdos who produced snuff films, child adult content, violation adult content, and other fudge-up shoot to be distributed to paying customers. Every one of these guys was caught and eliminated or jailed for their various crimes over the years, but the records of the network and its client information was burned, and most of the material and clients have been in the wind since the 80s. Story 84. The Toy Boy Killer is definitely the worst of the lot to me. The dreadful torture those women endured, and how he played a horrible tape telling them in detail what horror awaited them, and how there was absolutely no way for them to escape. Plus the fact the woman also helped him do this to other women. I always feel really sick and sad that anyone could do something like this when I think about that case. Just awful. Story 85. Many of them are very good at social mimicry and faking emotions. They know how an emotional response should look and behave accordingly. They usually also have unassuming appearance. They are the opposite of what you'd think a serial killer looks like, and that's the scary part. Serial killer looks just like any normal human does. Story 86. The Iceman. Richard Kuklinski was the inspiration for the character of Stone Cold Steve Austin, who became one of the highest-drawing wrestlers in history. Story 87. One of the most disgusting things I have ever read about a serial killer was Ted Bundy allegedly saying he continued to visit the bodies until it wasn't physically possible to visit them anymore. Sick. Absolutely disgusting. The letters Albert Fish wrote to the parents of 2 of his victims were seriously effed up, highly descriptive. Anthony Sowell's house smelled so bad from the bodies that people could smell it throughout the block he lived on. I could go on forever. Unfortunately, there are so many. And the most disturbing thing about serial killers as a whole, the fact that they walk amongst us daily and you'd never know. Far too many of them are just average folks, doing average everyday things just like any one of us. Story 88. My school bus driver was Mary Beth Tinning. She eliminated a bunch of her own babies. She was an absolute wreck and a psycho, and we students knew it in 9th or 10th grade. She wasn't just off in a quirky way. She was a nervous wreck who would pull the bus over to cry on the side of the road. Story 89. That most show high levels of lead or heavy metal toxicity, and there is a high causation ratio between aggressive anger, lead toxicity, and murderers. It was once debunked, but has gained traction lately as more evidence comes forth about serial killers and murderers being clustered around toxic areas. Story 90. My wife saw a nurse practitioner for a while. Turns out her brother is a serial killer and is currently rotting in prison. Story 91. If you want to listen to something disgusting and disturbing and not sleep well for some time, the Toy Box Killer made an orientation tape for his victims. It's on YouTube. Story 92. There are not many Danish serial killers on the run or in hiding because crossing the border and hiding in another country would mean entering Germany, where someone speaking Danish wouldn't be able to hide for long without becoming known to authorities. Story 93. What's really disturbing is how many serial killers have existed and or still exist that we don't know about. Story 94. For me, it is disturbing how chill killer can be when talking about horrific killings. For me, most disturbing is Edmund Kemper, co-ed killer, and how calm he was when talking about killings. And for me, it is disturbing how smart he was, and Jeffrey Dahmer also. Intelligence coming from that people scares me a lot. Story 95. Besides the tragic and depraved acts and the disturbing psychology behind it all, I think their most disturbing thing is how much they attract people. Both men and women fall head over heels for a lot of these murderers, as if their depraved nature makes them even more appealing and attractive. And not just intimacy. We keep pumping out movies and streaming shows and podcasts about these people. And almost every woman I've ever known loves this true crime stuff. My ex would listen to this while going to sleep sometimes. Story 96. How inept law enforcement are. Every single widely known serial killer got away for far longer than they shoulder have by absolutely vile police work. Cops don't give a shoot about most victims. Story 97. The whole situation about Wuornos is disturbing to me. I can't help but feel like she was given just an awful hand in life and never actually had any chance. Her situation honestly breaks my heart, and it disturbs me that I feel sad for a serial killer. Answer: same. I've heard that one of the Johns had stopped to visit her on the way to his kid's birthday party, and that story is always presented as a reason to feel sympathy for him. Sorry, but why would I feel bad for a guy who stopped to coerce intimacy from an impoverished person on the way to his kid's B-day? She also didn't torture her victims like so many other serial killers do. I believe it when she said she eliminated because they were aggressive, not solely for pleasure. Story 98. Only slightly more than half of all takedown are solved in this country, meaning that there are likely several serial killers out there, still unidentified and hunting. It is also likely that at least a few people reading this post interact with one of those on a daily basis. Story 99. So many are described as a nice guy that kept to himself. Now thinking how many people you would describe that way, and then what are the chances they could be doing it too. Story 100. Almost every serial killer around is only around because cops refuse to listen to victims. They go after women of color, intimacy workers, and undocumented immigrants, specifically to exploit the fact less people care about them. Story 101. Many of them have done good deeds before and after their killings. Jeffrey Dahmer was a U.S. vet. John Wayne Gacy was a businessman and active in the community and performed as a clown for children. Eileen Wuornos claims she was brutally violated by men as an adult worker and eliminated out of revenge. She admitted it was a lie, but the made-up story has inspired female violation victims and made her a hero. Ted Bundy warned about the dangers of adult content, saying it contributed to his desire to eliminate. He also helped the police catch another serial killer. He said serial killers often return to the spot where they buried their victims, and they will keep mementos, pictures of their victims. Green River killer Gary Ridgway was caught after the police stake out his last victim's location. He was found with jewelry, rings, and watches of his victims. Story 102. There's a thing called the Trinity of serial killers. There are three things that almost all of them have: mental illness, a history of being abused as a child, and a head injury. Story 103. Did most serial killers blend in with the normal population pretty well? I think that's pretty scary. Story 104. Many of them lived double lives. Neighbors, co-workers, even friends thought of them as kind, polite, and trustworthy. For example, John Wayne Gacy performed as a clown at children's parties while hiding dozens of bodies under his house. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, was a church leader and compliance officer, blending into his community for decades. Story 105. That 99 of them are men. Realized while watching Criminal Minds is like a documentary of what issues do these men have this time? What triggers their emotional distress this time? And why are they taking it out on other people? Why are they so emo and can't handle their emo? Story 106. That the vast majority of them grew up in extremely abusive households, to include extreme mental, physical, or intimacy abuse, or combination of above, and that if society would have stepped in for proper support and counseling, loss of people's lives could have been saved over the years. Story 107. That American society produces them at a higher rate than any other culture, and we don't talk about it other than to make TV shows and entertainment out of it. The way white men are raised in America creates serial killers, school shooters, family annihilators, and narcissistic behaviors more than any other documented culture to have existed, and we do not address it because saying so is somehow misandry. Story 108. It's not really a fact, but if you want to be disturbed, you can read BTK's diary. John Douglas did a retrospective on the BTK case to compare his profile to the real thing, and uses examples of BTK's actual diaries and sadist fan fiction he wrote. I guess that's my fact. BTK wrote sadist fan fiction of his desires and used them to tide him over or build to his next eliminate. I should be all over this question because I've read probably upwards of 20 books all about serial killers. But in all that time, in those books and just being a intense horror and true crime psychopath, nothing ever really bothered me. Could listen to horrific eliminate like the Toy Box Killers and it was gross, but I could move past it. The BTK diaries got me. Inside the Mind of BTK by John Douglas and Johnny Dodd. Story 109. The fact that Bundy would return to the bodies of his victims and have intimacy with the decomposing corpse. Story 110. I heard a theory that the most common type of serial killer is truckers eliminate hookers. There's never a locus for the eliminate because they're always traveling. The most disturbing fact that I know is that a serial killer in Vancouver owned a pig farm and was serving up his victims, again, hookers, to unsuspecting visitors of his barbecue parties. Story 111. A few of them haven't been prosecuted because they're being protected by the withholding of the Epstein list. Story 112. The police officers who were called to Jeffrey Dahmer's residence when a naked underage boy was running away released the victim to Dahmer. One of those police officers became president of the police union. Story 113. The most disturbing fact isn't the violence, but the meticulous, boring administrative work that comes after. Ted Bundy would spend hours washing a victim's car to remove forensic evidence. Dennis Rader, BTK, wrote detailed, boastful logs of his crimes. John Wayne Gacy went back to his job as a respected community organizer. Story 114. The most disturbing skill a serial killer possesses isn't stealth or violence. It's emotional mimicry. They study and replicate human emotions to gain trust. Ted Bundy used his charisma to lure victims. Jeffrey Dahmer convinced police to return a 14-year-old boy to his apartment by playing the concerned boyfriend. Story 115. That there were, and most certainly are, serial killers with larger victim counts and more vile acts than any of the famous ones like Ted Bundy, Dahmer, Gacy, or Andre Chikatilo, but they go unknown by the world at large because they took place in non-first world countries. Luis Garavito eliminated 194 children, committing unspeakable acts, and is believed to have done so to more than 300 in total. Abul Jabbar, believed to have eliminated over 300 in Afghanistan. Javed Iqbal, over 100 in Pakistan. Pedro Rodriguez Filho, over 100 in Brazil. Kampatamar Shankaria, 70 in India. Hoshang Amini, over 60 in Iran. Yang Jinhai, over 60 in China. William Unek, over 50 in the Congo. Ahmad Siraji, over 40 in Indonesia. Moses Sitole, over 70 in South Africa. The list goes on. They say serial killers remain at large because they often target the less dead, those whose society is wont to ignore. It appears that the same is true for the killers themselves. You want to see a Netflix miniseries about Yang Jinhai or an Oscar-winning movie about Abul Jabbar? Story 116. You want the most disturbing fact about them? All of the ones we know of were only arrested because they failed in one way or another to avoid being caught. In these modern times, technology has imposed the challenge of repeatedly being militantly vigilant to covering up their crime. Consistency in how they commit the crime and how they choose their victims creates patterns which can lead to being caught. A meticulous planner is likelier to not be caught when you compare them to someone who eliminate upon an impulse. They will have looked at things from every angle they can think of before they act. They'd have done their best to craft a believable alibi which can withstand scrutiny to a certain extent. Those successful serial killers are out in the world among us, unseen and unsuspected. They don't get complacent. They don't let their success go to their heads. Their mental fortitude and wit is a sword tempered by patience and sharpened by their ability to blend in. You won't know until it's too late. Story 117. Wayne Adam Ford was only arrested because he confessed what he was doing to his brother, because he wanted help to stop Eliminate Women. His brother convinced him to turn himself into police. He brought a woman's severed breast with him to prove he was Eliminate Women. At the time, he wasn't on law enforcement radar at all. He was a long-haul trucker and left dismembered body parts all around the country so nobody connected the killings. He could have just kept doing it. Story 118. It's disturbing to me in the sense it actually affects my thought processes daily, but not really super crazy. The BTK serial killer would choose homes where the door was unlocked because he said that was an invitation. So I always lock my doors. Story 119. Many stopped Eliminate when they became council officers. Oftentimes they were animal control officers, and it brought the same, if not more pleasure than Eliminate people. Story 120. There are, at any given time, roughly 500 active and at-large serial killers in the U.S. Most will never be caught. Story 121. I think that most of the time they are super kind and personable, so you have no idea what you are getting into. Story 122. A lot have head injuries in common. Kinda scary that an unchecked hit to the head could unravel a person to the point of them becoming a monster. Story 123. With female killers, depending on the situation, poison is usually the choice of Eliminate someone, especially in the older ages because of the way medicine was at the time. It was concluded that the member of the family died of an illness. It's only discovered when the killer goes a little nuts on the Eliminate. Martha Wise is a very good example. Story 124. Martin Hale, a.k.a. the Iron Bridge.